being said, today we kind of hosted this session with the purpose in mind that a lot of people send us questions like, is it possible to get scholarship in Canada? Is it very difficult? We know it's very challenging. How do we get that very, very coveted scholarship? So we essentially put together a panel, and today we have our guest speaker, Taos, who essentially attended UBC and was a recipient of the ILOT scholarship. And we brought him in to kind of give you a little bit of an overview of how he received the scholarship, what they're actually looking for, right? That's kind of the big question. So without further ado, Taos, thank you so much for joining us today. And I just want you to kind of introduce yourself, where you went to high school, your university, your program, and a little bit about why you wanted to come to Canada to study.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for the intro. I studied, I went to a lot of schools. So I graduated from ISD. I did the IB diploma program, and then went to the UBC for computer science in 2015. The reason I ended up in Canada, I think I was talking to you about this before, is, UBC was one of the best schools I was applying to, but I personally wanted to go to the US, so I didn't really want to go to Canada at the time. But UBC did offer me the ILOT, and it was a full ride scholarship, so it made sense, and it was a great school anyway. So it made sense that I didn't end up in UBC. So that was more or less the decision making factor. It was nothing fancy. Didn't spend too much time thinking about it. If you get the ILOT, they end up calling you, and so they called me and said, I got the ILOT, and I said, sure, I'm coming, and that's basically what it was.
Okay, that seems pretty straightforward. So did you find the scholarship process complicated for Canada specifically, or did you find it pretty straightforward?
The application process is fairly straightforward. I think the only thing is, unlike many other scholarships around the world, you can't just apply for the ILOT. It doesn't quite work that way. So your school kind of has to nominate you. And that essentially means that you'd have to be one of the top students in your school to get nominated in the first place. And there's a minimum criteria that you have to meet in terms of grades, which is pretty high to even get nominated. So it's not one of those things where you can just apply. So that's probably the only complicated part. But if you check those boxes, it should be relatively straightforward. If you can convince your school to nominate you, and if you have the minimum grades that you need to have to apply for the ILOT, you're good to go. You can apply. It's fairly straightforward. It's just convincing your school to do that. For ISD, I was very lucky because ISD already had ILOT scholars before me, so they had the process pretty streamlined. The college counselor actually just he approached me saying that he wanted to nominate me, so it was I didn't really have to do much. They just nominated me for it.
I see. Okay, great. So you mentioned you did apply to a couple. Explored the option of USA. So how did you kind of approach the whole research process of a scholarship? I know you said your school nominated you, but in terms of just the overall process, did you do some research, and if so, how did you go about that?
I didn't. I actually just wanted to go to one of the top universities around the world. So for me, I was doing well in IB and all that, so it was there. So for me, it was just, apply to all the top schools that you want to get into. It's usually the same as everyone else's, Harvard, MIT, Stanford, and all of that, the whole bunch. And yeah, so that was sort of the thought process. And yeah, I guess in hindsight, I was, I guess to a certain extent overconfident, where it was something's going to work out. Eventually it did. Eventually UBC worked out. But the one university I really wanted to attend was Harvard, and that didn't work out. So yeah, in hindsight, it was sort of like that. But yeah, I didn't spend too much time on researching. Probably should have, but didn't.
I see. Okay, that's good to know. So besides grade, you did mention that you were kind of one of the top students in your class. What else do you think made you successful? So extracurricular skill sets, what else can students kind of develop that could really make them successful to receive one of these coveted scholarships in Canada?
Yeah, so when I applied, I think the only two options that at least I was aware of or people knew about in terms of the scholarship was ILOT from UBC, and there was a similar one at U of T. And U of T had just started it. So it wasn't something that existed even the year before I had applied. And I didn't apply for the U of T one because I got to know about it later on. But yeah, so those were the only two options really. And for both of them was 30 students per year for each separately. It was 60 students all from all over the world brought into Canada in full ride scholarships. Everything else, every other scholarship in Canada, are relatively minor. So they're not full scholarships or anything close to that. So yes, in terms of that, it was fairly straightforward. That from my perspective, there was only one option that I could potentially apply to. In terms of what made it through, so in terms of grades, like grades, that's a prerequisite. So when I applied, I'm sure the number's a lot higher now, but when I applied, there were, I think, 500 to 600 nominees for the ILOT award from around the world. Like everyone had an A plus grade. Everyone was the top of the class. Like otherwise you wouldn't be among those nominees, right? So you're not really competing with grades. Grades is sort of like it's like a given. Like if you're nominated for the ILOT, you probably have really good grades. So it's sort of the second step that actually makes the decision, where it's basically like, what kind of impact have you had on the community? And ILOT is very big on community. Like even within the ILOT, like I'm very connected with the ILOT community even today. Like we actually just had an ILOT event like last week. So from alumni to current scholars, we stay in touch, we help each other out, we're always there, and we are very motivated by community. So when they're making a decision, they really are trying to decide whether or not you fit in into that community. So that's sort of, yeah, I guess that's probably the biggest factor, where it's like, how can you prove to them that you're obviously that you're academically brilliant, but also that you have actually done work for the community to a certain extent, or can have a huge impact on the community at UBC and beyond. So that's sort of how ILOT comes in.
I see. Okay. So I guess that's how ILOT kind of looks at their candidates that are potentially applying. So what impact that they've had on the community. But say when you're in high school, and if you're talking to a high school student, let's just say specifically to Bangladesh or any other international countries, would you recommend that, you know, when applying for scholarships, of course, everyone says you have to have really good ECAs, but are there certain ECAs that they should focus on more than others? If so, if you could give some examples, I think that'd be great.
So I think one of the things that we have to we have to really understand is that it's not about the quantity of ECAs. It's not even about what kind of ECAs you do. It's about conviction. At the end of the day, it comes down to conviction. So how deep do you go into the same? So before me, the ILOTs that I knew, one was a guy named Ishraq. There was another one called Mutadi Fayaz. There was someone else named Nafiz Jalil. These are the three that I was in touch with before I had applied. All three of them have very different backgrounds in terms of what kind of work they did, extremely different from each other. And I had a very different experience as well. So between the four of us, we're like four very different people. So it's not that it was because, you know, XYZ did a certain kind of extracurricular activity that we ended up getting an award. It was more like, so now I'll give you an example. So Nafis organized the first Bangladeshi Olympiad for, I think it was environmental sciences or sustainability or something like that. So he organized the first Olympiad for it. And he was a pretty, you know, well-known name in that sort of sector in environmental sustainability in Bangladesh at the time as a high school student. So that was his sort of, I guess, standout, if you will, right? These were things that he was really good at. And it wasn't something that, you know, he just did by attending like one-off event. It was something that he was convicted about, that he, you know, worked a lot on over during his high school or maybe even middle school years. I think the same thing applies to like many other ILOT scholars. Like a lot of my friends in my batch, these are people who've, you know, founded a nonprofit organization before or have worked in like similar causes that they believe in, and they went really deep in the cause that they believed in. So that plays a very important role. And also it's about credibility. So one is like, you know, first maybe you go ahead and sort of, you know, I don't know, like make your organization do something, like, right? So it could be like environmental sustainability, which was the case for Nafis. For me, it was like technology in a different sector. And then second step comes credibility, like who have you worked with? What kind of impact have you had? How many people actually, you know, have benefited from this to a certain extent? And all of that becomes a factor. And that's sort of, those are the kind of activities that I've seen people do really well with ILOT. That's obviously not to say that these are the only activities that work, but most of the people that I know from the ILOT community have done something for community. And I guess that's an interesting question that just came in. Our most powerful EC is always about community. It's not. So I did both. So for me, I had a nonprofit division where I was organizing an Olympiad for software innovation. So this was the first of its kind in Bangladesh. So I was the founder of that Olympiad, and it was funded by the US government. So it was sort of, one, the fact that it was a national level Olympiad. So we had events like all around the country. We had people coming in from all around the country. And secondly, the fact that it was backed by the US government. So those two things played a very important role in sort of determining that, okay, this is a relatively large event, and the fact that there are big names backing it. For-profit, at the time, I was also working on a startup called Incognito that I also mentioned in my ILOT application. which was my own thing as well. So this was sort of that I co-founded, something I co-founded with a friend of mine. It was an app, and I think that was also mentioned. So it doesn't necessarily have to be about community, I guess, but I wouldn't know which one they place more weight on. But yeah, I mean, I'm literally as for-profit business a person could get, just because like I ended up, quitting my job. I ended up starting a company, and that's my profession now. But in terms of applying before college, in terms of weight, they are thinking about what impact you have on your community. And that, I mean, for-profit businesses have impact on communities as well. So it's not to say that, you can't have a for-profit business that has an impact on community. So, but yeah, so they do place a lot of weight on community.
Okay, so I think you've kind of unpacked a lot of things over what you just said, and I think if I would summarize what you just said, of course grades are important. I think a lot of times people are asking like, oh, like just is it enough if I get like A pluses? But you have to understand that you're competing with a lot of other A plus students, right? So like what really distinguishes you from the rest of the crowd, right? That's the biggest key thing, and I think. Another thing that you said in terms of ECAs is like kind of like the depth of it, right? You just can't have like 15 ECAs and just like top level. You really need to have have your kind of niche or something that you really specialize in, and that results in benefiting people or the community or whichever area that you're focusing on. I think that's really a key thing that helped you out in your journey in terms of getting the scholarship.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I guess my next question would be, and I'm sure you'll have a lot to add on this, is what are some of the common things that you've seen that are some of the mistakes that a lot of students either do when they're applying for scholarships, or a lot of unsuccessful candidates do, that might be a good watch outs for people who are currently applying for scholarships? If you have anything to add there, that'd be great.
Mistakes. So I know of at least 2 such incidents specific to the ILOT where people had their ILOTs revoked in the application season. So 2 or 1, I think 2. Yeah. Where, the student applied for so they got the ILOT, so they got the call, they got the award. And then there was some form of verification, which sort of led them to believe that whatever the claims that they made in their application was a lie. So they ended up revoking the award, right? So one of the things that people often think is that, hey, I come from Bangladesh. No one gets to verify anything in Bangladesh. So how about I lie in my application, right? And that's something that I would definitely advise very strongly against. The guys, who are making this decision, behind the scene, they've dealt with Bangladeshi applicants and Indian applicants and Russian applicants and European, everywhere around the world. Like they've dealt with applicants from around the world. So they understand, like they can pick up on what's a lie and what isn't for the most part. And more importantly, there are usually fact checkers within them. Like it's not as if that the decisions that are made are solely made by you. So in the International Student Initiative, the ISI office, right? There were Bangladeshi scholars who worked there. They might still be there. There were, Ethiopian scholars who worked there. There were Indian scholars who worked there. There were American scholars who worked there. So they have ILOT is one of the most diverse communities that I've had the privilege of being a part of. So it's not like that just because you're coming from Bangladesh, they wouldn't know what's going on in Bangladesh. Like they have a very clear idea. And there's a high chance that there are Bangladeshis in that office that's going to make that decision, just because they do employ a lot of ILOT students within it as well. So it's very important to really understand that you can't just lie and get your way through. Like it doesn't happen. I think that's one of the common things. Like a lot of people lie and then they might not get the award, and they think that maybe there was something wrong, etc. Like they might have misjudged, but it's not that. Like if you lie, in most cases they know, so they'll just reject you straight up, not make a fuss out of it. In cases where they give you the award, they still do verification. So if eventually they realize you lied, you still get your award revoked. So you don't want to lie. You want to be very, like UBC and obviously most universities in North America are very strict about academic honesty. So you want to be very serious when you write that application. Like everything you write and everything you mention should be 100% true.
I see. I think that's a great point that you make, because oftentimes I think it is a very, very big misconception that, we're a very small country, so it might not be that they're verifying the information that you're providing. So a lot of the times, your references might not be as legit, or they might not be as true or correct, and they just kind of blatantly provide that information. And I think that's a very, very big and important statement, that do not do that, because they actually do check, especially when it's, such a big scholarship like the ILOT. Like, I'm pretty sure that they're verifying at every step of the way to make sure that, you're really deserving of the specific scholarship that they have available, because a lot of people are applying for this scholarship. Would you have an idea about how many people, the amount of people that are applying for this?
So again, like I mentioned before, it's a nomination process, so you can't apply. So there isn't a number of applicants per se. So it depends on the number of nominees, right? So I would imagine at this point, it's probably 1,000 nominees per year or something, or maybe even more. I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if it's more. When I applied, it was around 600 nominees for the year that I applied. It was close to 600 nominees, and of them, 27 of them got the award in my year. So that was sort of like the acceptance rate for ILOT in my year. Note that the reason this makes a difference is that all 600 nominees were A+ students, like every single one of them, because you otherwise can't be considered as a nominee. You're not a nominee if you don't have an A+ average or something. So they had a minimum requirement, which is A or A+, I believe. So yeah, so that's basically the statistical chances of getting an ILOT. It usually hovers around the same, and it's a single-digit percentage among people who are already academically at the top of their class.
I see. Okay. That definitely makes a lot of sense. And that just goes to show that, the percentage of people receiving this scholarship is very, very less. So you really need to make sure you're a very, very strong applicant and a very strong candidate to be even kind of considered to be nominated, right? So that's a great point that you make. I think just to wrap up, because we're almost at the end of our interview, what is kind of your top maybe 3 or 4 points of advice that you would give students who really want to come to Canada with a partial or a full scholarship? Like, what are the things that they should be doing from now on? Say maybe they're in grade 10, 11, what should they be doing to really build and craft their application so that they can, get maybe not the ILOT, because like you said, you need to be nominated, but just some of the other scholarships in Canada. What advice do you have for international students?
Yeah, I think I'll answer that right now, but just for 1 minute, I'm going to switch gears a bit. I'm going to go back to what I started off with, the fact that I mentioned I applied to US and I wanted to go to the US. And I think I wanted to get to this at some point, so I'll just say it right now. In hindsight, the fact that I didn't go to the US worked out really, really well for me. So there wouldn't have been a better choice for me. So I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. The reason, because I went to Canada and I worked at, I studied at UBC, I got to work at some really good companies, and I got to work in the US for a year in a row. If you're an international student in the US, you can't do that. I was an international student in Canada, and I could work in the US as a student for 1 year in a row. And that's an incredible opportunity that I had, which, in hindsight, if I wasn't a US university, I could only work the summers, right? Unless my degree was over and I could do OPT. And that's one thing. And the second thing is, I got to work with IBM in Canada, and because UBC is one of the top schools in Canada, they end up hiring a lot from, UBC, U of T, the whole, the big three and plus more, like Waterloo and all of that as well. So what ended up happening is, I got the chance of inventing something at IBM, which ended up becoming a patent in the US while I was still in school. Like, those kind of opportunities are very rare. And it was only possible because I went into Canada. So that's for a first. And then the PR opportunities and all of that are a lot easier in Canada than it is in the US. In terms of what advice I would have, I think number one is really sort of venturing out and understanding all your options. This is very important. Like I mentioned, when I applied, I was applying to the US only. If Canada was sort of like a remote option for me. But then I ended up coming to Canada and it ended up working really well. Like, nothing else I can imagine that would have worked as well as this. So really apply to as many universities as you can. Don't be too hung up on okay, I have to get the ILOT or the Pearson B. Lester scholarship in U of T or whatever the case be. Apply everywhere, apply to as many places as you can, and then look for scholarships wherever you can. Most universities have relatively some size of scholarships. And think of funding early on, where it's can you fund with family? Can you fund with other scholarships, whether local or abroad? And based on that, make a list of universities that you can apply to anywhere in the world. So there are great universities in Singapore, there are great universities in Australia, in Canada, in the US, in the UK. So really figure out what the best places are and then apply everywhere. And then wait for something to work out. And eventually something will. This is a game of stats. You could be the best applicant in the world, and not get into a specific place. So I'll give you one quick example before I end, which is one of my very close friends. He and I, we both ended up applying to Ivy League colleges and to UBC ILOT, right? And we both were sort of wherever we go, we go. So my friend ended up not getting the ILOT, but ended up getting into an Ivy League college. And I ended up not getting into the Ivy League college and getting the ILOT scholarship. So in hindsight, it's not as if like I had a stronger application because I got the ILOT and he didn't, and neither is it that he had a stronger application that he got into the Ivy League and I didn't. It's there is a huge luck factor involved in applications. So even if you apply somewhere and it doesn't work out, like it's fine. It is part of the process, and not every admission officer is going to look at the world the same way that you do, and that's okay.
I think those are fantastic points that you bring. And I think that, the scholarship process is as daunting as it is. And, when you do get rejection, and I think it's very important to talk about that it's not the end of the world. When you are getting picked for scholarships, it's not the same process. And I think that's very important to kind of keep in mind. I think we do have a question.
Can you expand on funding beyond schools? Yes, I'm not actually too sure about what kind of opportunities Bangladesh has right now. I know I have read somewhere that for postgrad, there are some options where the government can fund you. I'm not sure how to apply for that. I actually haven't looked into it at all, but I would imagine that there are third-party sort of funding opportunities, at least some. Like I'd be very surprised if there are none. And they might not be as popular, but if you look hard enough, you might be able to find something. Sometimes it's also that if you end up working for a company sometimes could sponsor you on the condition that you have to fly back and work for them for a specified number of years. So all of those different options, like try to think of funding as much as you can. And if none of those are options, that's okay. Then apply to the universities that have scholarship programs, or where you can get a student loan or something like that, where you can make it happen.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I think with Bangladesh, it's a little bit different just because maybe a lot of those private lending options aren't available. Personally, yeah. I even don't know, even though I am an international student, I personally don't know, at least not when I applied 5 years ago. So wouldn't be able to shed some light on that either. But yeah, I think the points that you've made are really, really fantastic. And I really hope the people who are watching today found this session helpful. Again, if you have any specific questions regards to scholarship, just send it over to us and hopefully we can have those answered. Again, thank you so much, Taos, for being here today, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here. We really, really appreciate it. And I think you've provided some really, really valuable insights that a lot of people will find valuable. So thank you again for taking the time.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. Take care.